In the kitchen, I could feel an unspoken tension weighing down the air. The table was already set, candles flickering gently over the romantic dinner I'd prepared for Michael. The savory aroma of roasted meat and fresh herbs filled the room, but even those comforting scents couldn't break the silence hanging between us. When Michael finally came in from work, he greeted me politely, but I noticed his eyes carefully avoiding mine. There was a certain guardedness in his behavior, as if he were shielding himself from something unsaid. We exchanged only a few short phrases as I served the plates, each sound and movement highlighting the uncomfortable quiet. Once dinner was on the table, I hoped it would ease the mood. We sat down, but the conversation was just as sparse. I tried to ask about his day, to talk about our week, but he only nodded and responded in clipped phrases. It felt as if an invisible wall was keeping us apart, the warmth in our connection somehow gone. Then, suddenly, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and I saw him stiffen. Without a word, he got up and left the room to answer the call, leaving me there, alone and troubled. I leaned against the table, trying to push away the unsettling questions that began filling my mind. Why was he being so distant? Who could be calling him? Minutes dragged by, each one thick with doubt. My mind raced, imagining who he could be talking to, picturing him speaking to someone else, maybe even someone he found more interesting than me. My chest felt tight, anxiety building, until a realization struck me. Our relationship was hanging on by a thread, and I needed to find out what was going on. After dinner, the walls of our home felt like they were closing in. Michael returned to his usual routine, and I was left to battle my swirling thoughts alone. I felt overwhelmed, desperate for fresh air, for space. So, I grabbed a jacket and stepped outside, not noticing until I was in the street that it had started to rain. The storm was heavier than I expected, and the drizzle turned to a downpour almost instantly. My thin t-shirt clung to my skin, cold raindrops running down my back and shoulders. Puddles filled the sidewalk, but I didn't stop walking. It was as if the rain was washing away the frustration that had been building up inside me. Soon, I found myself near a small cafe, a warm light glowing from its windows. It looked cozy, inviting. I stepped inside, brushing water from my hair as a few curious eyes glanced my way. I ordered a hot tea, settling into a quiet corner to gather my thoughts. Moments later, I looked up and saw a familiar face, Keith. I hadn't seen him in years, yet he looked almost the same. When he spotted me, he came over, smiling wide. "May? Is that you?" he asked, his voice friendly, like an old memory. "Keith, I didn't expect to see you here," I replied, surprised and smiling. We started catching up, talking about old times. But soon, the conversation took on a different tone. His gaze lingered just a moment too long, trailing over the droplets, clinging to my shoulders before finally meeting my eyes. A silence settled between us, familiar, yet charged. I felt my breath catch, my pulse quickening, as if waiting for him to say something that would break the spell or deepen it. "You're soaked," he said with a slight grin, glancing at my shoulders. "Seems like it," I laughed, shrugging, trying to keep things light. But inside, I felt something shifting. The attention felt different, comforting, even intriguing. For a moment, I questioned whether it was purely coincidence that we'd met here. Our conversation continued, and the atmosphere between us became charged in a way I hadn't expected. Before I knew it, our goodbye felt like the beginning of something else. As I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze, the way he'd looked at me. After that night, Keith and I began crossing paths more often. Our conversations became a kind of escape from the growing tension at home. We'd text, and when he invited me to a small party with mutual friends, I agreed without hesitation. Michael would be there too, which felt like a safe choice, just friends, nothing more, I told myself. Yet, deep down, I knew there was something else drawing me to these meetings. The evening started quietly. Michael seemed distant, caught up in conversations with people I barely knew. I watched from the sidelines, feeling strangely alone amid the laughter and noise. Then Keith arrived, standing out from the crowd with his easy confidence and warm smile. When our eyes met, he walked over, handing me a glass of wine. "I'm glad you're here," he said softly. "Me too," I replied, my heart picking up speed. We chatted about everyday things, keeping it light, but there was a growing awareness between us. Eventually, he leaned in, close enough that his voice was barely above a whisper. "You look amazing tonight, May," he murmured, his voice a low whisper that sent shivers down my spine. His hand found its place on my waist, a touch so light it could almost be dismissed as friendly, but we both knew better. I froze, my senses heightening, every nerve focused on that single point of contact, the tension between us hanging in the air, unspeakable yet undeniable. That touch, though, was anything but. I froze, feeling a surge of emotions, and turned toward him, unable to find the right words. For that one moment, there was a clarity between us that transcended friendship. Neither of us moved. Then, as if in slow motion, I heard Michael's voice nearby, calling my name. I stepped back from Keith, my hands trembling slightly, and we exchanged a look that held an unspoken understanding. We'd crossed a line. The rest of the evening blurred, but that moment replayed in my mind, over and over. As I looked at Michael, at Keith, I realized I'd come to a choice, a crossroads. What was once innocent was now a step toward something unknown, and now it was up to me to decide which direction to take. The party felt like it would never end. Even though Michael was nearby, his presence seemed almost invisible, like a shadow fading amid the noise of the music and laughter. He'd gone off to grab drinks, leaving me alone again, watching the flashing lights and people dancing. And then there was Keith, close as always. Somehow, it didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. It was as if each encounter, each step we took, was bringing us closer to some unspoken line that couldn't be undone. Together, we drifted toward a quieter corner, away from curious eyes, where the dim light wrapped around us in a soft, private haze. The music was distant, like it was from another world, creating an illusion that we were alone. Keith seemed different. He wasn't the casual friend I'd known. There was something intense in his eyes, something raw. Leaning against the wall near me, he sighed softly. We were so close that I could smell his cologne, a scent that felt oddly familiar and comforting. "Violet and I hardly talk anymore," he said suddenly, his gaze drifting down. "Everything that used to connect us seems to have disappeared." His words echoed within me, a mirror to my own thoughts. For the first time, I truly understood that he felt the same coldness, the same loneliness, and the same need to find someone who just got it. His words weren't just a complaint. They felt like a confession, a recognition of something we were both afraid to say. "You don't know how much I understand," I replied, my voice steady, though I could feel my insides twisting. Michael was somewhere nearby, but at that moment, it was like he didn't exist. Keith looked at me, his eyes moving down slowly, pausing at my short dress, which emphasized my seductive long legs. His gaze was subtle, but I felt the tension between us deepen, an invisible cord pulling us closer. "You look incredible," he murmured, his voice dropping. And then his hand was there, hovering close enough to feel his warmth. The way he said it wasn't just a casual compliment, it felt personal, carrying something that stirred an unexpected thrill inside me. We were close, enveloped by shadows, the distant hum of music seeming to pulse and sync with my heartbeat. His face was only inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin, yet neither of us dared move, as though any shift would plunge us into something from which there was no return. The unspoken pull between us grew, a silent invitation neither of us could refuse. I could feel his breath close to my ear, sending a shiver down my spine, our faces only inches apart. For a moment, everything else disappeared, the music, the people, the lights. All that existed was the sound of my own quickened breath. Without a second thought, I leaned in, and he moved toward me. Our kiss happened fast, as if we'd both finally let go of the restraint that had been holding us back. All our doubts and fears seemed to vanish in that moment, leaving only us, tangled in a feeling neither of us could deny. Time stopped, though the kiss was brief, and reality came rushing back like a cold wave. I pulled away, my mind scrambling as I glanced around, the risk of being seen hitting me hard. "Keith," I started, but his look said it all. There was no going back. We stood there, breathing heavily, our faces close, with the muffled sounds of the party in the background. My mind was a storm of emotions, a whirlwind I couldn't control. Just then, Michael walked up, smiling, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He looked at me with warmth, completely unaware of what had just happened. I could barely meet his gaze. My heart pounded, and before I could think, I blurted out, "I want to go home," my voice trembling as I spoke. Michael looked at me, confused but obliging. "Sure, if that's what you want," he replied gently, missing the turmoil in my eyes. The drive home was a blur. Michael tried to make small talk, but his words barely registered. My mind was elsewhere, stuck on Keith, on the kiss, on the feeling that I couldn't shake. When we reached the bedroom, the tension in me had built up to an unbearable peak. I couldn't stop thinking about Keith, his hands, his kiss. My desire was overwhelming, and without even realizing it, I found myself reaching for Michael, hoping the intensity of the moment would drown out the battle raging inside me. That night, we were closer than we'd been in a long time. But every moment with Michael was layered with thoughts of Keith. It was confusing, wrong, yet I couldn't stop. At one point, I almost whispered Keith's name, catching myself just in time. My heart raced, and I pulled away slightly, trying to regain control. Lying there beside Michael, my thoughts tangled around the kiss and how it had changed everything. I realized that I hadn't sought out Michael that night because I wanted him, but because Keith had awakened something inside me that I thought had been lost. Days passed, and my mind was still full of thoughts of Keith. I tried to focus on my usual tasks, on my life with Michael, but Keith's kiss, his gaze, the magnetic pull between us, none of it would let me rest. I thought maybe these feelings would fade, but each day only deepened my sense of being drawn toward something forbidden. Keith hadn't texted or called, as if he, too, was trying to pretend that nothing had happened. That silence made me uneasy. Then, one evening as I was leaving work, I saw a message light up my phone. It was Keith. "Want a ride home?" Something stirred within me as I read those words. It was a simple offer, but we both knew there was more behind it. Unable to resist, I agreed, my heart racing as I waited. Within minutes, Keith's car pulled up, and as I slipped inside, the familiar scent of leather and his cologne enveloped me, instantly transporting me back to that night at the party. We drove in silence at first. I looked out the window, trying to calm the storm building inside me. After a while, he spoke, his voice low and careful. "Do you remember that day we ran into each other?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the road. It felt like coincidence, but I've thought about it a lot. His words pulled me from my thoughts, bringing back every memory of that day in the cafe, every shared look, every lingering touch. "I've thought about it too," I admitted softly. I realized that this had been building for a long time. Each glance, each innocent touch, every moment we'd shared had only deepened the pull between us. I wasn't sure what to say next, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze on me. The car pulled to a stop in front of my house, and we both fell silent. It wasn't the usual quiet that follows a conversation. This was a charged pause, a moment of shared understanding. Inside, I was a mix of nerves and excitement, standing on the edge of something that both terrified and thrilled me. Without saying a word, Keith reached over and took my hand, his fingers brushing my skin, igniting a spark that I could no longer ignore. My breath hitched, and our eyes met, each of us recognizing that we'd been holding back something powerful. In a single, wordless moment, Keith leaned in, and I felt myself drawn to him. Without saying a word, Keith reached over and took my hand, his fingers brushing my skin, igniting a spark that I could no longer ignore. My breath hitched, and our eyes met, each of us recognizing that we'd been holding back something powerful. In a single, wordless moment, Keith leaned in, and I felt myself drawn to him. Our kiss was no longer just an impulse, it was the release of a desire we'd kept hidden for too long. His hands moved down my back, fingers tracing along my waist and finally resting on my hips, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. His touch grew more assured, one hand gliding over my thigh, fingers tracing lightly along the curve, then pressing gently but firmly. My short dress, chosen without a second thought that morning, now felt like a deliberate invitation. I felt my heart pound as his hand moved upward, reaching my lower back and holding me there, as if to steady me in the rising intensity between us. My own hands found their way to his shoulders and then to his chest, feeling the warmth and strength beneath his shirt. He kissed me deeper, his hands exploring, moving to the small of my back and lower still, as I pressed into him, feeling every line and curve that separated us melt away. The tension in his touch was both fierce and tender, leaving me breathless and alive to every movement. As he held me there, his arms around me, I felt a surge of longing that was no longer containable, a shared urgency, something we'd held back for far too long, finally given release. The world outside the car faded entirely, leaving just us, enveloped in the darkened space, as close as we could be. And in those moments, we crossed that unspoken line completely, our connection undeniable, powerful, and deeply felt. Finally, when I pulled away, gasping, reality crept back in. I knew we'd gone too far, yet the passion in his eyes made it clear that there was no turning back. He dropped me off at home, and I got out of his car, heart pounding, and walked to my door, still feeling the warmth of his touch, the echo of his whispered words in my mind. Every step felt surreal, the weight of what I'd done settling in slowly. Inside, I hoped to have a few moments alone to calm myself, but the lights were already on. Michael was home, sitting in the living room, waiting. A wave of panic washed over me. I took a breath, trying to steady myself, but even as I walked toward him, I could still feel the lingering touch of Keith on my skin, the memory of our kiss so fresh that it felt like a part of me. As soon as I saw Michael standing there, I felt a chill spread through my chest. He was waiting for me, his expression unreadable but intense. My heart started pounding as my mind scrambled for an excuse. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Keith just happened to be passing by and offered me a ride. Total coincidence." Michael didn't respond right away. He simply watched me with that unflinching gaze that always seemed to see right through me. The air between us grew heavy, and I found myself unable to meet his eyes. He noticed everything, the smudged lipstick, the faint scent of Keith's cologne lingering on me. He frowned, taking a step closer, and I could feel the tension radiating off him. "Are you sure it was just a coincidence?" he asked, his voice calm, but with a coldness that sent a shiver down my spine. "Of course," I replied, my voice shaky as I tried to keep up the lie. "And the cologne?" he asked, his tone sharper now, cutting through my weak excuse. I froze, words escaping me as silence filled the space between us. I could feel my deception unraveling in front of him. Not knowing what else to do, I muttered something incoherent and hurried to the bathroom, hoping that a shower might wash away not only the scent, but the guilt that clung to me. But when I stepped out, Michael was waiting. In a swift motion, he grabbed my phone from the counter, scrolling through the messages until he found what he was looking for, Keith's name glaring up at him from the screen. Without waiting, he stormed back into the bathroom, his voice a mix of fury and betrayal. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" he spat, and before I could react, he turned the shower knob to cold, the icy water shocking me as it drenched me all over again. "Michael, stop," I cried, trying to get out, but he blocked the door, his face dark with hurt and anger. "You're lying to me," he yelled, his voice trembling. "I can see it, I can smell it. I saw the messages." His voice was low, every word a heavy blow. "Did you really think you could keep this going forever?" I trembled, soaked and shivering, not just from the icy water, but from the terror of what was happening. Michael wasn't just angry, he was devastated. In that moment, I knew everything was over. Our marriage, our life together, everything I'd taken for granted, was dissolving before my eyes. After I managed to dry off and dress, I found Michael waiting in the hallway. His expression was cold, almost distant, as he looked at me with a mixture of betrayal and anger. "Pack your things and leave," he said in a low, steady voice. "I don't want to see you here anymore." The finality of his words cut through me like a knife. I'd expected this, but hearing it out loud was a pain I wasn't ready for. Without another word, I went to the bedroom, feeling his gaze heavy on my back, and started to pack. Every item I put into my suitcase reminded me that this was the end, that I was leaving the home we'd built together. Within minutes, I was out the door, my hair still damp, belongings thrown together haphazardly, and nowhere to go but to Keith's. I called him, my voice shaky as I told him briefly what had happened. Surprised, he agreed to let me stay. Within half an hour, I was at his door. Keith opened it wordlessly, taking my bags and guiding me inside. The relief I'd hoped for never came. There was no victory in this. It was a hollow ending, and we both felt it. Days passed, and we tried to find some sense of normalcy. But in truth, everything felt tense. Our conversations grew shorter, our glances more cautious. Even Keith seemed to feel the weight of what had happened between us, yet he, too, didn't say anything. Then, one evening, he came home later than usual, his face drawn and tired. "Someone slashed my tires," he said, not looking at me, as he set his keys on the table. "And smashed my windows. I don't think it was random." A heavy feeling dropped into my stomach. My thoughts went straight to Michael. I knew he was the kind of man who might do something like this in a moment of rage. I wanted to ask if Keith thought it could have been a random act, but the bitter look on his face told me he'd already ruled that out. "No," he replied, almost to himself. "Someone knew exactly where to find my car. I don't think this was just chance." My heart sank, guilt and fear swirling within me. I knew it was Michael. His anger that night had been too real to just fade away. But telling Keith would only deepen the mess I'd dragged him into. We fell silent, the gravity of what I'd brought upon him settling between us like a heavy cloud. That night I lay awake, thinking about Michael, about what my choices had unleashed. Even though I'd left, it felt like my past was haunting me, a shadow I couldn't outrun. Keith's apartment, once a place of comfort, now loomed over me as a reminder of how everything had come undone. My thoughts spun in endless circles, replaying how I'd ended my marriage and hurt someone who'd once loved me. As the days went on, things between Keith and me continued to deteriorate. We barely spoke, our conversations reduced to polite exchanges. The warmth and passion that once drew us together felt like a distant memory. Even Keith had changed, his easy confidence replaced by a guarded, distant silence. The spark between us, once so intense, now felt like a fleeting illusion, leaving only an emptiness that seemed to grow with each passing day. I was starting to see clearly that this whole affair had been nothing more than an escape. I'd been running from my own life, chasing after a fantasy. But now that fantasy had turned into a harsh reality, one that I couldn't avoid. Keith, who once seemed like a refuge, now felt like a stranger, and I was left to face the ruin of everything I'd let slip away. In the quiet of his apartment, I realized just how far I'd fallen, and for the first time, I was left with no one to blame but myself. One evening, Keith finally broke the silence. He sat beside me, his face serious, stripped of the warmth he once had. "May, we need to talk," he began, avoiding my gaze. I felt something tighten in my chest. "I can't offer you a future," he said, his voice soft but firm. This can't go on. I never promised you anything serious." The words, though true, felt like a slap in the face. I'd known this deep down, but hearing it aloud left me stunned. He continued, trying to keep his tone calm. "Violet is coming back soon, and she doesn't know anything. I don't want to lie to her. You can't stay here." I closed my eyes, feeling everything collapse around me yet again, but this time, it was final. I'd allowed myself to believe that maybe, somehow, Keith could become something more than a temporary comfort, but that illusion shattered before me. He'd never seen us as anything more than an escape, and I'd been lying to myself by thinking otherwise. My time with Keith had only been a way to avoid my own reality, to flee a marriage that had already crumbled, to fill the emptiness that had grown inside me. Now, with everything laid bare, I saw clearly a broken, distorted reflection of my own choices. Keith stood up from the bed without saying another word, and I remained seated, lost in thought. What I'd once considered a refuge now faded into nothing, an illusion that had lasted too long. Not only had I lost my goal, but I'd lost myself along the way. I tried to fill a void with Keith, but it had only been a temporary fever, one that burned out as quickly as it had begun. The last few days at Keith's passed in a blur. I woke each morning with the same question: what now? My marriage with Michael was destroyed, and my connection with Keith had turned out to be nothing but an illusion. Now, I had to find a way forward, to pick up the pieces, but I didn't know where to begin. Finally, I packed my things and left the keys to Keith's apartment on the table. He wasn't home, which made leaving a little easier. There was nothing more to say. We both understood that our story had ended. Keith had been my escape, but I now needed something more, my own path, my own sense of self. I walked down the street, feeling the cold wind pushing me forward into an unknown future. Each step felt like a beginning, but fear gripped me. I'd never been alone. I'd always leaned on someone. Now, it was up to me to figure out what I wanted from life and to stand on my own. Eventually, I found a modest little apartment on the edge of the city. It was simple, quiet, a blank slate. It became a symbol of a new life, one I would have to create from scratch. The first few days in my new place were filled with an unsettling silence. I sat on the floor among unpacked boxes, trying to understand the person I'd become, wondering if I could rediscover the person I'd lost. Time moved slowly, but that slowness became a comfort. I found a job at a small shop nearby, something simple, but it kept me occupied. My days passed quietly, yet in that quiet, I began to feel like a whole person again, different from who I'd been with Michael or with Keith. I was building a new version of myself, one that no longer ran from reality. Each evening, I'd open the window and let the cool wind flow through, carrying away the remnants of my old life. With each day, I felt lighter. I knew this path would be long and full of challenges, but I was finally ready to face them. I was no longer dependent on others for happiness or escape. This journey was now my own, uncertain yet mine alone. Standing by the window one cool autumn evening, I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, feeling the fresh air fill my lungs. The future stretched before me, unknown and perhaps difficult, but for the first time, I was ready to embrace it fully, to build a life on my own terms, even if it meant starting from the very beginning.